Afternoon and welcome. My name is Catherine. I'm the Centre for Public Integrity's Research Director, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for this webinar on pork barrelling. We're very lucky to be joined by two most eminent speakers, Professor Anne Twomey AO and Anthony Whealy QC, who are going to talk to us about the problem of public funds being misused for partisan political gain, the legal aspects of this problem, and what on earth we can do about it. If you have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A during the webinar, and we'll address as many of them as we're able to after we've heard from both speakers. Before handing over to Professor Twomey, I'd like to tell you a story. It's one that I first heard recounted by Jeffrey Watson SC, and I found it, the way he told it, so compelling that I would like to share it with you too. And in telling you this story, I acknowledge and celebrate the storytelling traditions of First Nations people as I join you today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. This is a story about two applicants for grants of Commonwealth funds. One, the Coaldale Waves Soccer Club, is a club with no floodlights, no dedicated change rooms for their players, limited storage facilities and inadequate drainage for their pitch. The other, Mossman Rowing Club, is a club with a state-of-the-art gymnasium and boat shed, twin pontoons, a trailer compound and storage. Coaldale applied for a Sport Australia Community Sport Infrastructure Grant to revitalise their fields, put in solar-powered floodlights and storage and improve their amenities. Mossman Rowing Club also applied for a community sport infrastructure grant to build new boat racks and extend a pontoon. Coaldale Waves Soccer Club is located in the safe Labor seat of Cunningham. Mossman Rowing Club is in the seat of Warringah, which in the lead up to the 2009 election was held by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott and looking less than secure. Mossman Rowing Club was granted the funds that it applied for. Coaldale Waves Soccer Club wasn't. Stories like this are important because they remind us of what it might look like on the ground in our communities when the Australian National Audit Office reports that a minister has intervened in the award of funding and there has been a distribution bias in favour of marginal and targeted seats, with the award of funding not consistent with the assessed merit of applications. To talk us through this problem of public funds being used for partisan political gain, the relevant legal issues and what can be done to fix the problem, I'd now like to introduce Professor Anne Twomey AO. Professor Twomey is Professor of Constitutional Law and Director of the Constitutional Reform Unit at the University of Sydney. She has practiced as a solicitor and worked as a researcher for the High Court of Australia and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Research Service. She has also served as Secretary to the Senate Legal and Constitutional Committee and acted as a consultant to various government bodies. Last year, Professor Twomey was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for Distinguished Service to the Law, to Legal Education and to Public Education on Constitutional Matters. Professor Twomey, thank you. Now, you are on mute at the moment, Professor Twomey, sorry.
Sorry, I don't normally do that. But anyway, look, thank you very much for asking me to speak about my least cheery subject of pork barrelling. So in particular, I've been asked to talk about the most recent report of the Commonwealth Auditor General into pork barrelling, which is the one that concerns the Building Better Regions scheme. Now, the thing is, at the Commonwealth level, they actually have some reasonably good laws and structures to deter pork barrelling. But the problem we find is that the politicians work very hard to find ways to avoid the application of those particular laws. And that's what tends to lead to the problems at the Commonwealth level. So what I'm going to do today is firstly go through what the Commonwealth rules actually are, and then how in this particular scheme they managed to significantly avoid or undermine the application of them. Now, first of all, and this is actually a consequence of a High Court decision, but because of the court decision in the Williams case, which is the one about the chaplaincy scheme, all Commonwealth grant schemes need to be authorised by legislation. Now, this means that there is some statutory basis for identifying the purpose of the scheme, unlike in the state level where this is problematic. Now, this aids the identification of misconduct in public office when grants are allocated for a purpose which is not the purpose for which the grant was given. Because if you have a statute authorising spending for a particular purpose, it's clear what the purpose is and you can identify it. So if the purpose of a scheme is to provide support for regional infrastructure development, then renovating the North Sydney swimming pool is not going to fall under that, even though they tried to claim it did. Okay, the second thing is Section 71 of the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act, and it says that a minister must not approve a proposed expenditure of relevant money unless the minister is satisfied, after making reasonable inquiries, that the expenditure would be a proper use of the money. And what does proper mean? Well, that's defined, and it says that proper means efficient, effective, economical, and ethical. Now, to be satisfied that you're spending the money only for those purposes, the courts have said a minister must in fact form a state of mind that can be described as one of satisfaction, and must form the requisite state of mind reasonably and on a correct understanding of the Act. And if you look further at what Justice Gageler says about that, he says, well, the state of mind formed by the minister must be one that is open to be formed by a reasonable person in the position of the minister on the basis of the information available to the minister, and must be one that is in fact formed by the minister through an intelligible process of reasoning on the basis of the available information. So there actually has to be an intelligible process of reasoning behind the satisfaction of the minister that all of this spending is efficient, effective, economical, and ethical. Now, Section 71 also requires ministers to record the terms of the approval in writing and comply with prescribed rules in relation to the approval of the expenditure. Unfortunately, there is actually no penalty for breaching this, and that's a particular problem. But it is still a breach of a law, even if there's no criminal penalty involved, but it's still a breach of a law if you don't meet those requirements. And that's actually important from an administrative law challenge point of view. It's also important from a corruption inquiry point of view. And finally, it also leads to breaches of ministerial codes of conduct if there's a breach of the law. So it's still significant. Now, the prescribed rules that it refers to are set out at the Commonwealth level in the Commonwealth Grants, Rules and Guidelines of 2017, and that's a statutory instrument, and it therefore has the force of law. Now, paragraph 4.4 requires officials to develop grant guidelines for all new grant schemes, and paragraph 4.6 requires them to advise ministers about the selection criteria and the process, and critically, the merits of the grants relative to those guidelines. So that advice in relation to merits has to be provided to ministers. And in particular, they have to specify whether or not a grant proposal would achieve value for money. Paragraph 4.12 provides that while ministers may approve grants that are not recommended by relevant officials, they must report annually to the Finance Minister by the 31st of March each year about all instances where they have approved a grant which the officials recommended should be rejected. Now, that report must contain a brief statement of reasons for the approval of each of those grants. Now, these provisions are aimed at ensuring that there's documentation, transparency, and the provision of reasoning to support decisions, particularly when a minister acts contrary to the recommendations of officials that have been based on merit. Now, the justification that you get from politicians for the absence of any penalties for breaches of these laws is that instead we're taking an approach that requires transparency. And that transparency in this way, revealing all this information, will prevent the corruption from occurring, okay, by exposing it. So does that actually work? Well, not when politicians come up with every trick in the book to prevent the transparency from actually occurring, which indeed makes you wonder why they think they need to hide their decision-making process from the public. It also shows that their conduct is very deliberately organised. It's not an opportunistic misuse of money on a particular occasion. It is actually planned and organised conduct. Okay, so let's take this back to this most recent example of the Building Better Regions Fund, okay, because so we've already talked ad nauseum about sports rorts and car park rorts and swimming pool rorts and the community safety ones, so we're now going for building better regions. Okay, so what was the first trick that they used? The trump card of all cards, which is cabinet confidentiality. So in this particular case, in order for the final decision makers were a panel of ministers. So they created a ministerial panel to decide. And then they decided that because they were a group of ministers, well, that really must mean that they're a committee of the cabinet because they're ministers. And therefore, as a committee of the cabinet, you can claim cabinet confidentiality in relation to all documents concerning your decision-making process. And so the reasons for its decisions, including the reasons that they had to provide to the Minister for Finance, were treated as being subject to cabinet confidentiality and then therefore could not be released publicly. And so therefore that removed all transparency and accountability. Now, in relation to round 3 of this particular program, of the 330 projects that were approved, 112 were chosen by the ministerial panel against the merit recommendations of the department. And the list of those projects, their location, and the reasons for overturning the merit-based recommendations of the department were all redacted from the relevant letter to the finance minister when it was finally released under FOI. So transparency completely disappears. The same redactions occurred in relation to round 4 of the program, where 49 of the 163 projects were approved, again, despite not being recommended by the Department for Funding. Okay, so that's trick number 1. Trick number 2, another cunning one, is the pooling of application. So what happens here is that the rules say that if you are making a decision that is one that is not recommended by the public servants, then you have to write this letter to the Minister for Finance and explain. But what if you tell your public servants, what you're going to do is create a big pool of applicants, so any applicant that would fall into the position of not being a waste of money, right, we'll stick them all in a pool. And so you send them to us as recommended, and therefore we just choose amongst that enormous pool whatever we like, okay? And then nobody can say that we acted against the merit recommendations. And so that's what they did. So was the Audit Office particularly impressed at that approach? No, it was not. Okay, so the next trick, because they clearly thought that just 2 weren't enough. So here, let's do more. The next trick was to give ministers an additional discretion above and beyond the relevant factors that are required in the guidelines in making the assessment. So in this case, you had the Better Regions Fund program. It set out rules and merit criteria which had to be met, and they were all put out there for applicants to comply with. So you made your application according to the various criteria. But then you're told, and by the way, the panel that finally makes the decision can make that decision by taking into account other factors, and we're not going to tell you what they all are. So you can't even address your application to the other factors. People are just going to do that behind the scenes, and you're never going to know what the factors were in terms of the decision that's being made. So the Audit Office, again, not very impressed by this, said that the use of other factors in the guidelines was inconsistent with the intent of the Commonwealth Grant guidelines and rules, and eroded the role of the published merit assessment process by enabling and introducing discretion to decision makers with little or no transparency. The Audit Office also noted that as the program progressed through its 5 rounds, there was an increasing disconnect between the assessment results against the published merit criteria and the application that were approved for funding, reflecting the increasing reliance on other factors when making the funding decisions. It stated that by the 3rd round, the panel's written basis for funding decisions did not make any reference at all to the merit assessment results and instead relied totally on the other factors. Okay, anything more? Well, yes. Okay, so the next one is failure to actually produce reasons after all of this. So the other way to thwart transparency is to provide perfunctory reasons for departing from merit recommendations. So if you read them, it usually says, oh, this is a good project. Yeah. Most of the letters to the Finance Minister are of that kind, giving no genuine reason for finding that the merit recommendation that was actually made by the public servants was wrong, just simply that there's a preference by the Minister for a particular project. Now, in the case of the Building Better Regions scheme, where reasons were given for funding not recommended projects, they did not address why the projects should receive funding as opposed to the projects that were ranked as more meritorious. In some cases, the decision makers went a step further. The ANAO found that in 164 instances, the ministerial panel allocated grants and decided not to approve recommended projects without giving any reason at all. Okay, so not even bad reasons, just no reasons. It also did that in 15 instances in relation to approving projects that were not recommended. Okay, so what's the upshot of all this? What was the result? Well, the consequence was that we have a scheme that ran for 5 rounds, spending $1.15 billion, that's billion, not million, $1 billion of public money on 1,293 projects. Now, in the infrastructure stream of that, which was 98% of it, 65% of those approved projects were ones that were ranked as not the most meritorious. Okay, so they overrode the decisions based on merit in 65% of cases. 6% of the approved projects were not even located in regions. Okay, 4.2% were in outer metropolitan areas and 2.2% in inner metropolitan areas. Okay, so grants that had nothing to do with the whole purpose of the scheme. Having said that, that's better than the previous regional scheme, which was rorted even more in that regard. The ANAO's analysis showed that the National Party received 29% more funding than it would have done if it had instead given effect to the merit rankings. It also showed that the Liberal Party and the ALP actually held the greater number of electorates in which eligible grant applications were made, but that the funding outcomes favoured Liberal-held electorates, which received twice as many grants as those held by Labor. The National Party held fewer electorates than any of them, but applications from its electorates were, surprise, surprise, more successful than those in Liberal and ALP electorates, both in terms of average numbers of grants and value of them. So what did we actually pay for in all of this? Well, I actually went through just one round of them, the round 5. Here's a little taste of what all the money was spent on. Mural painting on silos, upgrade of a mountain bike park, upgrading campsites, community centres, building an 18-hole mini golf course, an all-weather pickleball court, a playground, a floating pontoon, spectator seating at a sport ground. There are obviously quite a few people who missed out on the sports rort, so managed to get in on this one instead. Air conditioning in the Corowa Golf Club house, constructing some holiday cabins, a global centre for excellence in fermentation. This was my favourite. Adding Japanese ornamental garden borders to complete a lawn area. Upgrading the roof of the Magnetic Island Country Club. Installing a new town entry and gateway sign in Kilmore. And it just, the cost of some of these things is utterly staggering. So they paid $121,000 for the sign for going into Kilmore, and that was only half of the cost, apparently. Upgrading the irrigation system at the Rich River Golf Club, clearly not rich enough to pay it for itself, and got $783,000 for that. Constructing 4 metal sculptures at Derby Marsh, and upgrading the Exchange Hotel at a cost of $2.3 million. So look, all I can say is that in times of financial stress and stringency, a lot of these projects actually look to be highly overpriced, unnecessary in comparison to some of the more pressing needs of the day, and some appear also to be largely focused on private benefit. A lot of these are for private facilities that people then hire out, which I think is slightly problematic. And moreover, here's my last question for you. Where is the head of constitutional power to support most of this spending? Most of this stuff seems to have no connection at all to the Commonwealth's actual power to spend. It is not a national emergency that we need to plant some Japanese ornamental trees around a lawn or fix the irrigation system at a golf club. Okay, the nationhood power is not going to cut it. So where is the power? And if there isn't one, guess what we're doing? We're spending a whole lot of money, millions, up to $1 billion, completely unlawfully. Okay, now, final comment here is that I'm leaving it now for Anthony to go on about what we should do to fix it up. However, for those of you who want my views on it, I wrote a paper on this for ICAC a little while ago in relation to their pork barrelling inquiry, and there's a huge section on the end that sets out a whole lot of recommendations. So I suggest you have a look at that if you're interested. Okay, I'll pass it back to Catherine.
Thanks so much, Professor Twomey. It was, look, I'd agree with you, what you said at the outset, it wouldn't be cheery, but it certainly was most informative. So thank you. I'd like now to introduce Anthony Whealy QC. Anthony retired as a judge of the New South Wales Court of Appeal in 2012. He has since acted as an ICAC Commissioner, a Police Integrity Commissioner, a Law Reform Commissioner, and is currently Chair of the Management Committee of the New South Wales Crime Commission. On the integrity front, he is a member of the National Integrity Committee, a former chair of Transparency International Australia, and we are most fortunate to be able to claim him as the chair of the Centre for Public Integrity. Anthony, thank you.
Thanks very much for those generous words, Catherine. I guess my favourite story, going back to grants, is one of the earlier the grant program called Grants for Regional and Remote Areas. Professor Twomey's touched upon this. What amused me most was when North Sydney Pool, I can see it from my window, was given an extraordinary amount of money under that scheme. And I raised the issue with the Lord Mayor at the time. I said, how do you qualify for a grant under the Regional and Remote Areas scheme? And she said, oh, people from regional and remote areas come and swim here occasionally. And that seemed to be a sufficient reason for the justification for the program. Anyway, I want to talk probably about the state system. I mean, there's so much we could talk about. As Anne Twomey says, these issues are enormous, and they've been discussed now at great length over a few years. The Centre for Public Integrity has done some research on possible improvements to parliamentary oversight. And I think those suggestions we've made would have, applicable reach towards the state system as well as federal. In essence, we've said that there ought to be grant approval criteria, including merit selection criteria and program guidelines set out in primary legislation. The departments ought to be required to table at each step of the process documentation in Parliament relating to the grant administration. And thirdly, there should be a joint standing committee established to oversee grant administration and report regularly to Parliament. Now, that's just one aspect of possible reforms that we see as being useful. Of course, at a federal level, we also think there ought to be a code of conduct for all parliamentarians, and we've been agitating for an effective anti-corruption commission for a long while, and it's very pleasing to see that is likely to come to fruition very shortly. However, one of the constraints that apply at a federal level, which Professor Twomey's mentioned, amongst the various constraints and borders around grant programs, in addition to the Constitution, legislative authority, ministerial standards, administrative law principles, is the PGPA Act, and in particular Section 71, which Professor Twomey's told us about, and in particular the definition of proper use of relevant money being what I call the 4 E's: efficient, effective, economical, and ethical. So that provision or anything like it is not apparent at state level in New South Wales. And I think that that's a big gap. It's one of the things I want to talk about. All right, so the principal issues that I'd like to discuss in broad terms are: how do we constrain state ministers in their purported use of discretionary powers in relation to grants? And what role does the public service play? What role ought it to play? And is there any utility in using perhaps independent probity advisors as part of the process? In relation to these 3 issues, I'm going to say straight away that I'm very much indebted to Professor Twomey for the terrific paper she gave at the ICAC Pork Barrelling Forum, and which she's given me permission to read and reread. And I hope that I can assure her that I'm learning from it all the time. But I recommend it to everybody. It's on the ICAC website, and if you're interested in this topic, you must go there and read it. And the other person I want to just acknowledge is Nick Sellers, who's an old friend of mine. He was formerly the chief executive of ACLI when I first met him, and he's now a current Churchill Fellowship Program participant and a qualified probity advisor. So he's given me some interesting information on the use of probity advisors in the procurement system at federal government. So to both those people, I acknowledge my indebtedness for these remarks. So we've heard of some of the problems that arose in the most recently audited federal scheme from Professor Twomey. Do we have a problem in New South Wales? Well, the answer is yes, we do. And it's really strange, isn't it? I mean, I think back on our former Premier, who proudly announced that there was nothing illegal in pork barrelling. The Deputy Premier at the time said everybody does it. What's wrong with that? And that did seem to stamp the imprimatur on what was happening at state level. And I think things have picked up a bit. At least the current Premier has acknowledged that pork barrelling can constitute an integrity problem. And secondly, the recent report earlier this year that was authorised through the Productivity Commissioner and the Department of Premier and Cabinet. I don't know if anyone's got around to reading it yet, but it's well worth reading. And there are some 18 or 19 recommendations there. And I think that's good that we're starting to examine at state level what we can do to improve the system. But as Professor Twomey's paper, to which I've referred, has a look at two recent grant programs. One was the Stronger Communities Fund, and the second was the Regional Cultural Fund. Professor Twomey makes the point, I hope she doesn't mind me continually referring to her work, but I don't want to claim that these are my expressions, but I certainly concur with them. She makes the point that especially round two of the Stronger Communities Fund, which was a handout of $233 million, was, quote, appallingly handled, end of quote. Now, Professor Twomey sometimes makes some strong statements, but that one I think was an understatement because it was, when you examine it, it was absolutely shocking what went on. You have approvals without any formal authorization from the responsible minister. You have decisions made by the Premier and Deputy Premier without any authority. You have records destroyed or not kept at all. You have guidelines that are absolutely deficient or guidelines that are not even published. And you have something like 96% of the available funding going to projects within coalition-held state electorates. So that was, I think, to call it appalling is really an understatement. The Regional Cultural Fund was not quite as bad, but it wasn't a model of good behaviour either. The Minister for the Arts at the time declined to follow many recommendations, I think 1 in 5. And there were no reasons published or given for those departure from recommendations. I think there were 34 recommended projects that were ignored altogether, again, with no reasons given. And some 87% of the funding went to coalition-held electorates. In the Auditor General's conclusion, he's always less emphatic than Professor Twomey. He was really rather understated, I thought. He said, there's a clear perception that factors other than the merits may have influenced the grant decisions. I think that's a very, very quiet way of putting a rather damning factor. Anyway, as I say, to his credit, the current Premier took a different stance on pork barrelling, and so it was that we saw in February 2022 the report, which I've mentioned earlier, published with its 18 or 19 recommendations. And like the curate's egg, there was some good in it, but some things were not so good. Again, Professor Twomey's given a tick of approval to some of the things in there, and in the same paper to which I've made earlier reference, she's been critical. In particular, it seems that the primary recommendation was that there should be guidelines published under the auspices of a Premier's memorandum, which would tell everybody how they're to behave themselves. But of course, it's, I think, easy to conclude that that would be rather ineffective and definitely insufficient, because it's not a statutory instrument. It doesn't have, for example, the rigour of the Commonwealth rules and regulations. And so as it were, the lead recommendation coming out of the report really left a lot to be desired. And as Professor Twomey said again, the reform ignores the elephant in the room, and that is that grants are made to advantage a political party. Now, this is really at the heart of the argument about pork barrelling. When does it become a criminal offence? When is it a breach of ministerial standards? When does it affront the community's demand for integrity in these grant programs? And when you think that that's the real reason that this report was commissioned, it's disappointing that this particular central issue was not really addressed. Of course, it did address the undesirability of ministers using these programs to further their personal interests, but it did not really adequately address the use of money for political purposes. However, one essential reform that I think that was not included, but which I think really needs to be included, is for the enactment of something like Section 71 of the PA Act. And I think that that would be a very significant reform. The issue that I raised was regarding the minister. Where does he get his advice from if he's to form an opinion that would be in accord with a section like Section 71 and the rules and regulations at federal level? And normally that advice will come from the public service. But we know from for example, the Barilaro affair that we've seen in recent times, which fell upon the Liberal government in New South Wales at the most unfortunate time after the publication of quite a good budget. And the budget's been swallowed up by all of the controversy that's followed. But what we've seen from that report, it's not finished, from that investigation, it's not finished yet, and we haven't seen Graham Head's final report, is that there's been something of an unhealthy relationship between the public service and the ministers. And I think at the very least we can say there's always a danger that the public service will be lent on in some way or other by the ministers in relation to decisions, whether it's an appointment or whether it's a grant process. And so therefore that leads me to think whether there might not be some benefit in the idea of using independent probity advisors, at least in relation to projects that are sensitive, complex, or high risk. My understanding is that that system is being used at federal level in the procurement area with some success. Of course, it's not a perfect system. It's not a panacea. And I mean, there are, dangers of conflict arising there that might make it undesirable for a particular probity advisor to be giving advice at all. But nevertheless, I think the idea of having an independent external assessment from a properly qualified probity body or person is something worth considering. I remember in the early days of ICAC in New South Wales that that's one of the functions it performed. And I thought that that was a very useful function. Didn't happen often, but there were often highly sensitive, complex contractual matters that were arising where some sort of independent analysis and imprimatur was useful. And if it can work in the procurement field, to the extent that I understand it does, why couldn't it work in relation to the grant field? I think both procurement and grants are now regarded as justiciable. So there's some supervision of them, but I think the idea of getting some sort of independent grant advice would be helpful. So they're my thoughts on the state system. There's a lot more, of course, that needs to be done. I've only touched upon a couple of things that I thought might be useful. I don't know what Professor Twomey thinks. Have you given any thought to that aspect of it?
I've given thought to a lot of different recommendations in relation to these things, and as I say, I've put most of them in that ICAC report I did. But some of the extra things, one of the extra things I think is education as well. This has come back to me a couple of times since I made that comment, but ministers and members of parliament are given no education at all on the extent of their powers. They just think once they've got there, they've climbed their way up the greasy pole and they can do whatever they like. And no one actually tells them, well, here are the legal limits. There is this offence called misconduct in public office. Here's how you would how you would commit it. Here are the risks involved in doing these things. Nobody ever tells them that. And I've been told that by politicians themselves. So A key thing to start with would be properly educating both ministers and, critically, the people in their offices, because it's the ministerial advisors, as we've seen in recent times, who most commonly have their fingers in the pie and are causing the grief. So ministerial advisors and ministers need to be better educated as to what the limits are on their power and what their obligations are. You know, the High Court has said that a minister and a member of Parliament is obliged to act in the public interest in all the things that they do, not in their own interest and not in their party's interest, but in the public interest. And that needs to be hammered home, I think.
Who would educate? I'm interested to know where the education process might come from.
Yeah, well, I think they need to, you know, commission and organise someone to do that. So I was just seeing the other day in the United Kingdom that one of the roles of their, you know, the House of Commons Library, for example, is to undertake education of politicians and various sorts of things. So, you know, maybe part of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Research Service or the New South Wales Parliamentary Research Service could be involved in running, you know, sessions. I mean, they do little sessions for new incoming members of Parliament on, you know, how the standing orders work and stuff. But actually teaching ministers and their officers when they come in would be a very useful thing, I think.
This certainly sounds like there is a case for a kind of how not to abuse public power 101 course. And Anthony, really, I'm sorry, I didn't have the opportunity to thank you for that, because it is really helpful to talk about what the reform agenda looks like, so we know what we really need to pursue, because it's obviously a problem that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency, and it's helpful to be able to talk about the really essential changes. Now, we have had a number of questions come in from our audience, and I apologise to everyone who's asked questions, because I can tell you we won't have time to address all of them. So I'll just pick out some that we possibly haven't touched on so far. So we've had Jeff ask, point out that the ANAO seems to do a lot of good work, highlighting waste and worse, but nothing is done about it. They get fobbed off. Would a federal ICAC help? Would a federal ICAC be informed by the ANAO? And so perhaps, Anthony, I'll start by inviting you to share any thoughts you might have on that.
Yeah, I think the ANAO has been hampered by, cuts to funding, which have been undesirable. But it's done a terrific job all the same. But its focus is not anti-corruption. It's more performance-based, and in that area, it's highlighted for the public some very, very serious problems. And I think an anti-corruption commission will. To take up Anne Twomey's point, can provide education of a certain kind to parliamentarians. It can, if upon request, give advice in complex matters, and it can act as a deterrent by investigating and exposing corrupt conduct. So in all those areas, I think it would perform a very good task, and one which focused upon integrity and endeavoured to get rid of corrupt conduct, and that would include corrupt conduct in and around grant systems. So yes, we're very, very much heartened by the prospect of an effective anti-corruption commission being operative in the federal sphere, I would hope by this time next year.
Professor Twomey, would you like to add anything further there?
No, maybe we should get on to some more questions so we give it a bit more time.
Thank you. So we have one from Adam Graycar, who has said, there is a wonderful book on corruption in Kenya entitled It's Our Turn to Eat, which documents taking spoils by governments. It is about culture and a sense of entitlement. What the speakers today have outlined is a flouting of law, but a culture that allows it and a sense of entitlement. Where is the best point of intervention? More law, cultural change, better administration to make sure processes are robust? Perhaps here, Professor Twomey, I might start with you.
Yeah, I think the cultural change stuff is actually really important, and that in fact is a role of a anti-corruption body. So one of the things I'd highly encourage the Commonwealth to do when it's creating its anti-corruption body is not focus solely on the law side, but also on the education side, because what's really important is educating the public as to what the relevant standard is, what is acceptable in Australia, because the way corruption flourishes is when everybody thinks, oh, everybody else is doing it, it's just the way of doing business, or it's just the way of doing politics. And we've seen a lot of normalisation of that happening recently, both at the Commonwealth level and the state level, with politicians saying, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. So we need someone authoritative to come out and say, yes, there is something wrong with it. It is wrong. It is morally wrong. It is corrupt. It is the misuse of money that comes from taxpayers, and you're not allowed to do it. And so, I mean, I can say it, but I have no authority. We need something that gets out there to create the standard so that politicians know that they will be shunned and treated with disrespect if they behave in a particular way. So that kind of cultural change aspect is really important from an ICAC, but you need to build it in with potentially penalties, but also just trying to cut off all the different ways that they try and sneak around the system, all right? All the outs, the avoidance mechanisms. So cutting off the avoidance mechanisms administratively, putting in some proper laws, and most of all, building up an anti-corruption culture, I think would help.
Thank you. And Anthony Whealy, I might build on this and ask you this following question from Ken Cogle, who was asked, should the Parliament authorise and enforce codes of ministerial conduct rather than leave that to the Premier or Prime Minister to make and enforce them? He's asked, isn't ministerial conduct part of responsible government? Yes,
I agree entirely. I think one of the flaws of the ministerial code of conduct at federal level is that was left to the Prime Minister. I don't think that works. We've seen it in practice. It does not work at all. And I think we also probably need, in due course, something like an integrity commissioner who'd have some oversight in relation to less serious breaches of codes of conduct. And we also need a parliamentary code of conduct to cover not just the ministers, but also all members of the Parliament.
Thank you. Another member of our audience has asked whether you think that the Williams decisions and the Commonwealth grants rules and guidelines have made any improvements in the allocation of grants in the public interest relative to what happened previously, or perhaps it's too hard to say. Would either of you like to comment on that?
I'm happy to have a go. I think it is difficult to say. I mean, we know that public servants are now required to try and identify some kind of a head of power to support whatever your program is, but then it slips after that, because you might say, oh, well, here's my program, and it generally falls within the category of, well, look, there's a treaty there that says disabled people need to have, sporting facilities. But then when you actually provide your thing, you're not doing it for disabled people, you're doing it for other stuff. So it slips at the point of functionality. In the actual person who then makes the decision isn't in any way informed or constrained about those sort of limits that are inherently built into the head of power. So it ought to have done. There is some level of assessment that's done in advance, but it's not enough. And the other ironic thing about this is that the point at which you often see the Williams decision coming into play is when governments don't want to fund something. And they'll say, oh, no, we can't because of the Williams case. And so we saw that in particular about charities, where charities were getting a lot of funding cut off because the Commonwealth would come back and say, oh, dear, sorry, we would have loved to have kept funding that, but we've no longer got any power because of the Williams case. And in most cases, that analysis was pretty spurious as well. So you see it being used when they really don't want to fund something. But if they do want to fund something, they'll just say, oh, it's peculiarly adapted to the government of a nation and is something that the states can't otherwise do, when it's just nonsense. And of course it's not. But that's what happens. So I reckon 90% of the bad stuff still gets through, but maybe a bit got knocked off.
Okay. Thank you. Another member of our audience has asked about what happens once these grants of money have been made. And I wonder whether either of you could comment about, for the organisations fortunate enough to be granted funding, whether there's follow-up in place to ensure that the money is used appropriately.
I believe there is. The one thing about the Commonwealth and presumably the state is that they are actually quite picky in the end about whether or not you've complied with them and gone through all the hoops. So the amount of administration involved in having one of these grants is usually enormous. So I don't think that's so much the problem. Sometimes what happens along the way is that the whole project falls over because it's been granted in advance without anyone properly assessing. Like swimming pools are a classic case. You know, the government says, here, have a swimming pool, we'll just give it to you. And the poor local council doesn't actually have the money to fund the upkeep of the swimming pool, or the land that it was supposed to be on was actually supposed to be used for a school or something or other. So it's a lot of stuff that falls over along the way because it's not being properly planned. But no, people aren't using the money to go off and have a holiday in Argentina. That stuff, as far as I know, doesn't really happen.
That's reassuring at least. We have another question about whether we can treat pork barrelling as a financial crime. And Chris Gehrig, who's asked the question, has said it has victims and it has intention, which the person thinks is a fair part of the way to making out the case. So alternatively or supplementary to this question, it should be able to be seen as a breach of any oath of office. So should we treat it as a financial crime, do you think?
Oh, yes, I think definitely has that possibility. Misconduct in public office is the common law offence that's most often referred to in this context. And it's quite hard to prove. We all know the difficulties that have been occasioned because of the Court of Appeal's decision in Maitland. But despite the fact that it's hard to prove, I think that it clearly can be seen as a criminal offence, particularly where the political motive, is the primary and dominant feature of the decision. Would you agree with that, Anne, or not?
Yeah. The other interesting thing there is in the UK, they had a law that said that instead of sending you for jail to doing this, you actually had to pay the money back. And that was quite important in a case in the UK where the local council flogged off property at a low price on the basis this is property that had been social housing property. So they made it all look nice, flogged it off at a lower price than otherwise, because they figured that they would get more support by house owners in voting for them than from social housing people. So they chucked out the social housing people, got the house owners in, got sprung. And it was shown that the council had lost, millions of pounds in dollars by doing this. And then they said, well, you got to pay it back. Now, one of the two councillors who was pinged on this happened to be the heiress of a supermarket, I think it was Tesco or whatever, and actually did have millions of pounds, and in the end did have to pay millions of pounds back. But that would really put the wind up politicians if they actually to pay it back out of their own pockets. So something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely, it would indeed. Now, we might just ask one final question before we finish up for today, and that is, so we've heard about the things that ministers can get up to in their administration of grants programs. So what is the appropriate role for them in the allocation of grants fundings? Should they be involved in actually selecting grants recipients? What are your views on that? We might start with you, Professor Twomey.
I think that's a really interesting question. So one argument is that ministers should be involved at the stage of setting the policy. So, do we need support for sporting grounds, assuming they actually had the power to do this? But anyway, do we need money for sporting grounds? Yes, we do. Here's the amount of money that we're going to have for sporting grounds, and I will be involved in working out what the criteria are for the assessment. And then once all that's done, then we get independent people to actually make the assessment and make the decision. All right, and that's one way of doing it, and that would take out a lot of the whole of the pork barrelling problem. Politicians will then tell you, though, but I know my electorate better than anyone else, and public servants are in the city and they'll get all this wrong and I should be able to override them and stuff. And look, there is an argument there. So, a compromise is saying, well, you can override, but only if you can show what the actual evidence is to show that the public servant's got it wrong. Because mostly when a politician says, oh, I know and the public servant's got it wrong, it's just because, 3 people at the local coffee shop have said something to them. There's actually no evidence backing it other than gut feeling or, the people who are on the pre-selection committee want it. So that's an issue too. But, one way of getting rid of a lot of this was say, ministers, your role is setting the policy, setting the guidelines and the criteria, working out the amount, and then having it done at some kind of objective arm's length method afterwards.
I never agree to that, though, unfortunately. I think they'll always want to have a say. But I do think the 3 things we always talk about come in play here: integrity, transparency and accountability. If they're going to play a role, and they want to, and they're going to override a recommendation, they have to do it from a point of view of the public interest. That's where integrity comes into it. They have to demonstrate the reasons for doing it, and they must therefore then expect to be accountable if that's a decision that's politically disadvantageous to them.
It's a good note in a sense to finish up on that one, Anthony Whealy, because we always need to bring this back to the public interest.